in 1932, a war would take place in the Wheat Belt region of Western Australia. And now this is no traditional war, as you probably are thinking of a clash between countries that would create tension and then eventually spill over into brutal conflict. No, this was a war against the natural world, which humanity, no matter how hard we try, will always end up in us losing. Howdy, and welcome to the Native Naturalist channel, where today we're going to be walking down a set of events that would lead us to the now infamously named Emu War that took place in Western Australia, and how in the wake of an ever-straining relationship between farmer and government, the emus would not only dominate the cropland, but also win against an Australian militia. And now for our timeline, we're actually going to start at the conclusion of the First World War. You would actually see a flux of discharged veterans from the British forces and migrant workers going to the western side of the state of Western Australia. But for the purposes of our story, we're actually going to hone in on a specific town within this region called Campton. You see, in the early 1920s, the Agricultural Bank of Western Australia paid migrant workers to clear a bunch of land in the area to start setting up for a future agricultural town, where some of these migrant workers would actually put their paychecks back into the project and buy their own little slice of farmland, with the rest of the plots being reserved for these discharged veterans. And this was part of an effort to give these veterans a reprieve from the previous war and be able to work the land. A real Yauman type ideal type thing. And you're thinking, why Australia? And it's because Australia was still part of the British Empire at the time, and it was like, yeah. So yeah, that's how these soldiers ended up there. And you know, some years pass and a community develops. You have a football team, a cricket team, a local school, a general store, and as I said before, miles of farmland. Basically like any town that you would pass by driving through eastern Montana. But you know the classic phrase, nothing good can last forever. As you may remember from history class, the Great Depression was quite literally one of the worst economic time periods within modern history. And while globally, the Great Depression started sometime in 1929, you could say that there were some omens to this recession, which in our case is the international fall of wheat prices in 1926. And when you're looking at Campton during this time period, a town that has its entire economic backbone built on agriculture, especially wheat, and during this time period having the wheat prices fall, it's not looking too great for this town. To the point to where in 1930, Campton farmers, along with other disgruntled farmers from other towns within this region, would form a wheat growers union. And this union would actually hold strikes in October of 1932, which will kind of play a huge factor as we start looking at the larger timeline and when these emus started arriving. And in a weird, sick, metaphorical way, as the economic dam finally burst from the pressure on its cracks, so did the vermin fencing that protected the western sector farms from the wildlife. See, back in the day, around 1788, rabbits were released in Australia to be used as a form of hunting so that those who lived on the continent could have some form of food. And this became a problem when later Australia wanted to have an agricultural district. And to solve this, the Public Works Department in Western Australia would build and I don't like to use the word pest because they're wildlife, but a pest exclusion fence in 1907. It was used mainly against rabbits, but was also found to be pretty effective against foxes, dingoes, and emus, which, like I said earlier, was pretty good at keeping the wildlife at bay from the farming sectors, but that's only if it was maintained regularly, which it was. You had people that would be patrolling the fence, making sure that there was no weak spots. But for a 3,256 kilometer fence, this was a bit of a difficult endeavor to keep consistent. So eventually, after years and years of wear and tear, the fences would get to a point to where all they need was a little push and a certain weak spot for the floodgates to open. Now, there's no exact documentation on when we know the emus broke through the fence and came in these large swarms, but based on weather forecasts, ecology, and biology, we might be able to estimate in which they started to pass these fence lines and kind of get into the agricultural sector. So what do we know about emus? Well, we do know that when it comes to water, they're pretty opportunistic and that they tend to follow a distinct seasonal pattern when it comes to their migration throughout Australia. That being that whenever they have a chance to consume water, they will take large gulps and consume as much as possible. And by association, they will follow rain clouds and kind of, there have been some studies to show that they can like have a like weird sixth sense when it comes to different weather patterns, but it hasn't been really verified through like multiple studies because from what I understand and what I've looked through, emus aren't super highly researched. That's besides the point. And that their migrations are typically north in the summer and south in the winter. And so now let's put this all together. Okay, so we're back. I've come up with a rough idea of a timeline. This emu is way too big, so I couldn't fit it the entire timeline in a straight line, but you get the gist. So we do know one thing. So we know seasonally from June through August is a typical winter in Australia. So then we have one more date that will kind of help us figure out when they kind of burst through. And then we have November, which is when the military decided to show up for what would transpire. So now we just have September and October that aren't accounted for. And now this window right here is when I think the emus not only bust down the fence line, but actually made it to their first set of farms. And why do you think I would say that? Is because I'm assuming that if they're traveling from north, coming down south, that they're probably going to try to follow the coastline on their way down. So you would have a bunch of these emus that would be hugging this pest exclusion fencing, which I'll put up a photo right here of exactly where that fence line kind of resides. But they're probably following that fence line trying to find an opening. And one way or another, they finally get and they're able to bust down that fencing or find a weak spot in that fencing to hop over. And so I'm guessing towards the tail end, which makes sense because I'll also pull up a historical forecast, which demonstrated that July and August were kind of the wettest months within that time period. So they were also following the raincast, which would mean that they probably at least bust through the fence line between those 2 months. And so now we get to a part that we're going to have to make some logical jumps to get to the conclusion, but if you follow me, you might get there too. So September and October, I'm leaning more towards October is when they finally called in reinforcements, them being the farmers. Because I think they may have tried to handle the emus on their own because there was a bounty that was in place during this time period where you could hunt emus and get a bounty for them. I think from September to October is kind of in that time period where they try to figure it out themselves, and it just didn't go over well. And which would also make sense because, you know, with any type of government interaction, you're going to have some time lag between the farmer to the politician to the red tape of the politician and then eventually the military. So that would, I'm guessing, take about a month or 2 months to get that whole situation figured out, which would put us at around about November. So it's not an impossible timeline, but I'm not putting my firstborn baby on that statement. Anyways, so they eventually are able to pass through the fence line and cross over and complete their full migration down south. And in the process, they destroy cropland because, you know, it's an easy meal. And because of this, farmers would raise their voice and call out to the representatives. And they would actually hear a voice back. And honestly, I think the reason why the government responded was because of one of two reasons. One was because these farmers previously unionized, so their voices are louder and have more of an impact. And the second being because in the background, there's actually a Western Australian succession movement that was kind of also in the works. So maybe the government felt pressured to help, but regardless, the government would reach out to George Pearce, who was the Minister of Defense, and he would be the head for the plan of attack on the emus. However, for Pearce, there were 3 conditions that the government needed to fulfill before they could actually commit to this, bird coup, which is 1, only the troops were authorized to use the firearms. So anybody who was outside of that was not allocated to use any military firearms. 2, being that the troop transport was to be financed by Western Australia's government. 3, being that the farmers were to provide food, ammo, and accommodations for the troops that would be out there. So with logistics out of the way, Pierce would go ahead and start building out his team. And this included the following: Commander Wynne Aubrey Meredith, Sergeant S. McMurray, and Gunner J. O. Halloran. And these individuals will all be armed with Lewis guns. And for those who don't know what a Lewis gun is, here's a representation. And Meredith would state initially that the emus were too far out of sight for them to make a good shot, so that they would actually enlist the locals in order to herd them to be closer to the kind of red range in order to produce a, I guess, productive firing squad. But yeah. And now, during the research part of this video, I was kind of looking at various news articles during this time period in which they were discussing the tactics that Meredith was using, and they would put it on a public newspaper. And Meredith would state that it was like the emus were using guerrilla warfare tactics in order to escape being eliminated. So they would like split up into smaller groups and kind of just like run sporadically, or be able to like get out of range super quickly. And so with these emus being like 6 foot, I just imagine that instead of the Viet Cong like being in the trees speaking Vietnamese, the emus were the trees speaking Vietnamese, and just the thought process of an emu speaking Vietnamese was so funny to me. And now we're working from the 2nd to the 4th, in which Meredith said that him and his company would kill a large number of emus. It's never really documented, so I'm not quite sure how many were killed in this process. But they would actually be kind of stalking out a dam that is located in the area. And while they were looking over this dam, they noticed that there were over 1,000 emu running towards their direction as they were sitting on top of this dam. And in almost Looney Tune as fashion, these men, seeing these thousands of emu running towards them, set their Lewis guns on the dam. They sight in. They wait for the emus to enter the red zone. They have their finger on the trigger, and they pull it, and they jam. Majority of the guns during this, I guess, I don't even know, execution, jammed during the process. And so only 12 emus were eliminated in this swath. And obviously, because they hear bullets getting fired off, the rest of the 1,000 kind of just dissipate out into the outback. And at this point, I think that the company, including Meredith himself, were starting to lose it. In which Meredith would state, each pack seems to have its own leader now. A big black plumed bird, which stands at fully 1.8 meters high and keeps watch while his mates carry out their work of destruction. And in a creative mood, Meredith, along with his company, thought, what about if we mounted one of these Lewis guns on the bed of a truck and used that as a way to kind of chase these emus and fire off shots while we're chasing them? And I think they forgot to account for the fact that the terrain was rough enough to where these emus were fine. They were going full sprint to run away from these trucks. And the trucks couldn't gain on them because they were kind of just launching themselves out of the bed with how uneven the road is. And yeah, so it didn't turn out too good. And by the 6th day of engagement, which if you're keeping track, that is going to be the 8th of November, there were over 2,500 rounds that were shot during this time period. And the emu count, well, it's not 100% verified. There's some sources that say 50 emu were eliminated, some that say anywhere from 200 to 500 emu were eliminated. And we'll get into why these weird numbers are kind of concerning, and why it kind of makes no sense that there's no documentation on it. But like I said, we'll get into that. After their grueling defeat by the emus, Meredith and his company would packing it up, and Meredith, during his reporting, would state, "My men indeed have suffered no casualties, except their dignity." And with that being said, the Australian House of Representatives would pull Meredith and his company out of the region. However, this would not be the last time that we see these folks in the wheat belt. After the withdrawal of the military, the emu attacks did not cease. These farmers would still struggle to keep these 6-foot dinosaurs from consuming their crops, their livelihood, and their sanity. And this would lead to the farmers pleading to the government again to just bring back the military, especially now since that we're out of the winter into the summer. The droughts would bring these emus in thousands over to these farmlands where there's available water, decimating the crops even harder. And James Mitchell, which I probably should have checked the pronunciation of this before I recorded, but it's Primer, I don't know. Premier. No, Primer sounds weird. I'm gonna go with Premier. Why not? Premier of Western Australia, who was essentially just the Prime Minister of the state of Western Australia. So do with that as you will. He literally doesn't matter later on in the story, so whatever. He would respond to the farmers by his vote in the revitalization of military support back in this region to fight off the emu. And so on November 12th, they would revitalize the military support over in Western Australia to help in the eradication of these emu from the cropland. But this time, they would actually get support from local citizens to create their own little militia. So yeah, we get a fucking part 2. Let's go! So they take to the field a day later, and day 1, they pop 40 of these emus. And they struggle immediately after, but, hear me out. But by December 2nd, they were getting to the point to where they were killing like 100 emus a day. And it sounds like I am pro-military and anti-bird. And it's not what I'm saying. I just like the concept that it is taking so many people to eliminate so little emu. It's just showing the fact that these underdogs are no longer underdogs. They're slaughtering the military. The military has literally everything working for it, and they still are struggling to keep these populations down. So if anything, this is a hopeful story for most of wildlife. But that's besides the point. Meredith on December 10th would be recalled, and the second wave or second part of military assistance would be considered done. And in his report, he says that his stat list is 986 confirmed eliminations with 2,500 wounded birds. But this was over the course of 9,860 rounds that were shot. So roughly 10 shots per confirmed bird, which, like, what are these fucking birds made out of, dude? 10 shots from a Lewis gun? I'm pretty sure a Lewis gun shoots like a 786. Whatever. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it up here in the post edit, but like, that's a crazy thought. Although this number is debated, it is believed to be inflated. And despite the coal having its bumps in the road, the farmers still would plead to the government to still ask for assistance. They would ask in 1934, they would ask in 1943, and then I think they would ask also in 1948 for assistance, in which they would be turned down every single time. Instead, they would reinstate a bounty system that they put in place in 1923 that would give you some financial gain in order to kind of return these emus over to the local government, because these emus were used for leather and their feathers for, I think, medicinal purposes and oil and meat. So there was a financial gain to turn in some of these emus if you were to kill them on your property. Kind of similar to when you think of feral hogs in Texas and some of the counties holding like bounties for feral hogs in those areas. So kind of similar. So if you're from that area, point of reference. And this was kind of a move where, following the military assistance, the government kind of just like pointed the finger and was like, do it yourself, bro. Figure it out. Which, to be fair, there were 57,000 bounties that were collected over a 6-month period in 1934. So it was pretty damn effective, and it was like a good transition to get the farmers to stop depending on the military as much. And because they established that bounty system in 1923, a couple years before, or probably a decade before, the military showed up, that's why I have an issue with how they weren't documenting how many of these emus were actually being eliminated, because there's a financial gain to collect these emus. And it's not ever documented on whether or not the military gave the emus over to the locals, that they had ability to like kind of pick up their finances a little bit to recuperate from the loss in the agriculture, or the military took it themselves. There's nothing really there. If it's not really documented on lean towards more the military, but I'm not. I don't know. I don't know. So, yeah. Which makes me think that the numbers were inflated when they gave that initial like 200 to 500 number, because if you were killing that many, you would probably document it. But it's not verified, so take with that as you will. And as we're wrapping up here, it's always good to have a reminder that throughout history, in an attempt to control or eliminate the natural world, there will always be a swing to that pendulum. Rabbits are released onto a continent. Well, now that continent wants to have agriculture, and those rabbits are an issue. Well, we'll just put up a fence, and that'll keep all the rabbits out. Well, now you're limiting the migration pattern of various species. And as a result of that limitation, animals are still going to try to continue their migration pattern. So they're going to wear down that fence slowly and slowly. And after years and years of the various species wearing down that fence, eventually it would bust down, causing a wave of the species to cross over. And because of this flood, it would lead to an agricultural crisis that would just happen to coincide with one of the worst economic crises of modern day. So with that being said, I want to thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you found anything interesting or you wanted to comment about anything that was said in this video, feel free. And yeah, I'll see you on the flip side.